Before a single American leaflet fluttered down from the Pacific skies, it had to confront a wall not made of concrete or steel, but of ideology. This was the fortress of the Japanese military mind, a psychological citadel constructed over decades and considered as impenetrable as any island stronghold. To understand the seismic impact of an officer reading a simple piece of paper, one must first appreciate the profound depth of the conviction he held. This was the doctrine of Yamato Damashii, the Japanese spirit, an intricate belief system that made surrender not just a military failure, but a spiritual and eternal damnation. The cornerstone of this fortress was the emperor. Hirohito was not a mere monarch or a symbolic head of state. He was an Akatsumakami, a manifest deity, a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. His divinity was the central tenet of state Shinto, and it transformed the war from a geopolitical conflict into a seizen, a sacred war. To fight for the emperor was to perform a holy duty. To die for him was to achieve a form of apotheosis. This theological framework elevated military service to a religious sacrament. A soldier's life was not his own. It was a tool for the fulfillment of the emperor's divine will. The concept of personal survival was irrelevant when measured against the eternal glory of dying for a god. From this divine mandate flowed the modern warrior code, a revived and ruthlessly enforced version of Bushido. The 1882 imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors had explicitly codified this, stating that loyalty and courage were the supreme virtues, and that duty was heavier than a mountain, while death is lighter than a feather. This was not mere poetry, it was military doctrine. The Imperial Japanese Army's Senjinkan Field Service Code, issued in 1941 and carried by every soldier, was brutally unambiguous. Do not suffer the shame of being captured alive. It instructed soldiers to live without shame and to die without regret, saving the last bullet for themselves or dying in a final, glorious charge. Capture was not an option. It was the ultimate transgression, a betrayal so profound it defied comprehension. This ideology produced the terrifying tactical phenomena that defined the Pacific War for the Allies, the Gyokusai and the kamikaze. The term Gyokusai, meaning shattered jewel, was the official term for a suicidal, last-stand banzai charge. The symbolism was deliberate and powerful. It was nobler to shatter beautifully in a moment of glorious sacrifice than to remain intact, like a common tile, through the shame of surrender or defeat. The kamikaze pilots, the Takotai, were the ultimate embodiment of this ethos. Theirs was not a tactical mission. It was a spiritual one. They were not committing suicide. They were achieving a transcendent union with the divine wind of Japanese legend, becoming human shields for the homeland and the emperor. Their deaths were celebrated, not mourned, their memory enshrined at Yasukuni Shrine among the nation's most revered spirits. For the officers, the guardians of this creed, the pressure was immense. Their honor was inextricably linked to the performance and sacrifice of their men. To lead a unit to surrender was the deepest possible failure of leadership and a permanent stain on their family's name. The concept of a profound, unrepayable debt of obligation, was central. An officer owed on to the emperor and to his own ancestors. The only way to settle this infinite debt was through absolute victory or an honorable death. Surrender meant defaulting on this sacred debt, plunging one's family into perpetual shame and one's own spirit into oblivion. This unbreakable spirit was not an abstract concept. It was a tangible, battlefield reality that Allied forces encountered at a horrific cost. On Tarawa, of 4,800 defenders, only 17 soldiers surrendered. On Saipan, thousands of soldiers and civilians leaped to their deaths from cliffs rather than be captured. On Iwo Jima, General Kurabayashi's garrison of 21,000 fought almost to the last man, with only a few hundred taken prisoner. This fanatical resistance sent a chillingly clear message to American strategists. The enemy they faced was conditioned to view death as preferable to capture. The path to Tokyo, if fought with bullets alone, would be a road paved with the bodies of countless American troops and the entire population of Japan. It was within this context of strategic dread that the first, tentative ideas of psychological warfare were considered. The fortress of the mind seemed impervious. How could words possibly compete with a divine mandate? How could a leaflet persuade a man who believed his capture would condemn his soul and disgrace his family for generations? The American challenge was not merely to defeat the Japanese military, but to find a way to breach this psychological fortress, to find a crack in an ideology that celebrated its own annihilation. The first step was to understand that the fortress, for all its apparent strength, was built on a foundation of controlled information and absolute isolation. The coming paper blizzard was designed to shatter that isolation, and in doing so, expose the foundation to the corrosive power of the truth. By 1944, the strategic momentum in the Pacific had undeniably shifted in America's favor. Its industrial might was producing ships and aircraft at an unimaginable pace, and the island-hopping campaign was successfully bypassing strong Japanese garrisons. Yet, on the ground, for the Marines and soldiers tasked with the actual taking of these islands, the war was not a story of grand strategy and inexorable advance. It was a brutal, personal, and horrifyingly costly reality. The American problem was no longer one of eventual victory, but of the unacceptable price in American blood that victory would demand. The unbreakable spirit of the Japanese soldier was not a philosophical concept. It was a tactical weapon that threatened to drain the United States of its men and its national will long before the home islands were ever sighted. The battle for the tiny atoll of Tarawa in November 1943 was a horrific awakening. The preliminary naval bombardment, one of the most intense of the war to that point, proved shockingly inadequate against the deeply dug-in, reinforced concrete bunkers of the Japanese defenders. When the landing craft grounded on a shallow, unexpected reef, the Marines were forced to wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep water under a torrent of interlocking machine gun and artillery fire. The lagoon turned red. For 76 hours, the fighting was a close-quarter slaughter. The Japanese defenders, following their code, fought with a ferocity that defied tactical logic, launching nighttime banzai charges and dying in their positions. Of the approximately 4,800 Japanese defenders, only 17 soldiers surrendered. The Marines suffered nearly 3,000 casualties to take an island that was just 2 miles long. The American public, confronted with graphic photographs and staggering casualty lists from this obscure speck of coral, was stunned. If this was the cost of one atoll, what would be the price for Iwo Jima, Okinawa, or Japan itself? This pattern of fanatical resistance only intensified as the war moved closer to Japan. The campaign for the Marianas, particularly on Saipan in June-July 1944, revealed a new and even more disturbing dimension of the problem: the involvement of the civilian population. Japanese civilians on Saipan had been subjected to years of propaganda depicting Americans as monstrous rapists and torturers. As the battle turned hopeless, this indoctrination produced a tragedy of biblical proportions. Thousands of soldiers and civilians, believing capture to be a fate worse than death, committed mass suicide, leaping from the island's northern cliffs at places now known as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff. Mothers, clutching their infants, jumped from the heights, convinced they were saving their children from a horrific fate. For the American soldiers who witnessed this, it was a soul-shattering experience that defied all moral comprehension. It demonstrated that the will to die was not confined to the military, but was a poison that had seeped into the very fabric of the society they were fighting. In response to these costly victories, the Japanese High Command adapted its tactics, making the American problem even more dire. The days of the large, wasteful banzai charge that played to American firepower superiority were largely abandoned. In their place, a new doctrine of defense emerged, perfected by General Tadamaki Kurabayashi on Iwo Jima and refined on Okinawa. This strategy was one of protracted, bloody attrition. Japanese defenders would construct elaborate, interlocking underground fortresses, vast networks of tunnels, caves, and bunkers that were largely immune to naval and air bombardment. They would not defend the beaches in force. Instead, they would allow the Americans to land, drawing them into a deadly killing zone where every yard of ground would be contested from hidden, mutually supporting positions. The goal was no longer to achieve a decisive victory, but to make the American advance so slow, so costly, and so psychologically devastating that the American public's will to continue the fight would break before the Japanese will to die. Iwo Jima, in early 1945, became the ultimate expression of this new doctrine. The battle was a month-long nightmare of close-quarters combat in a subterranean labyrinth. The iconic flag raising on Mount Suribachi was a moment of immense symbolic power, but it occurred on only the 5th day of a 36-day meat grinder. The fight for the rest of the island was a brutal war of flamethrowers, grenades, and explosives against an invisible enemy who fought from the very earth itself. Kurabayashi's forces fought with terrifying discipline, almost to the last man. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken prisoner. The cost for the U.S. Marines was over 26,000 casualties, including 6,800 dead. The island, a mere speck of volcanic rock, had been transformed into a charnel house. Then came Okinawa, the final stop before the invasion of the Japanese home islands, an operation codenamed Downfall. For nearly 3 months, from April to June 1945, American forces were subjected to the full, horrifying fury of a cornered Japan. They faced the relentless kamikaze campaign, which sank dozens of ships and killed nearly 5,000 sailors. On land, the fighting was as fierce and costly as any in the war. When the battle was finally over, total American casualties exceeded 82,000. The Japanese lost over 110,000 soldiers, and tragically, an estimated 100,000 to 150,000 Okinawan civilians perished, many coerced into suicide by the Japanese military. The message of Okinawa was terrifyingly clear. The invasion of Japan would be a fight to the finish against an entire nation, military and civilian, that had been conditioned to prefer death to surrender. It was in the shadow of these staggering casualties and the even more horrifying projections for Operation Downfall, estimates of up to 1 million American casualties and millions of Japanese deaths, that the American problem reached its crisis point. The conventional military path forward seemed to lead only into an abyss of bloodshed. This strategic nightmare created an urgent and desperate need for an alternative. If the body of the Japanese military could not be broken without catastrophic loss, then perhaps its mind could be influenced. The terrifying lessons of Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa provided the grim, undeniable justification for a massive, all-out investment in a different kind of warfare. The psychological warfare branch, once a peripheral experiment, was now thrust to the center of the stage. Their mission was nothing less than to shatter the ideology of the unbreakable spirit and find a crack in the Japanese will to fight, thereby making the apocalyptic invasion of the home islands unnecessary. The road to Tokyo, they hoped, could be paved with paper as well as with blood. Confronted with the grim arithmetic of an invasion of Japan, the United States mobilized a new kind of arsenal. It was not forged in steel mills but in printing presses. Its projectiles were not tipped with high explosives, but with carefully chosen words. This was the paper arsenal of psychological warfare, a systematic, industrial-scale effort to win the battle for the enemy's mind. The goal was audacious: to convince the Japanese soldier that surrender was not only possible, but a rational and honorable choice. To achieve this, American propagandists had to become cultural engineers, designing messages that could navigate the intricate labyrinth of Japanese honor, duty, and shame. The intellectual force behind this campaign was the Psychological Warfare Branch, PWB, a unique organization that brought together an unlikely combination of talent. Its ranks included academics like anthropologist Ruth Benedict, whose research into Japanese culture provided a critical blueprint of the enemy's value system. It included journalists who understood how to craft a clear, compelling narrative. Most crucially, it included Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, whose linguistic fluency and cultural literacy were the operation's most vital asset. These Nisei were not mere translators. They were cultural translators, ensuring that the messages resonated with the nuances of the Japanese psyche and avoided the fatal blunders of a literal, tone-deaf translation. The foundational insight of the PWB was that traditional propaganda would fail. Insults, threats, and appeals to Western democracy were meaningless or counterproductive. Instead, they had to craft messages that worked within the Japanese cultural framework, exploiting its inherent tensions. They identified key pressure points: the soldier's deep loyalty to his family, his growing distrust of officers who lived in relative comfort while he starved, and the profound contradiction between the promise of a glorious death and the reality of a futile, anonymous end from disease or starvation on a forgotten island. From this analysis, a suite of specialized paper bullets was designed. The Singo Safe Conduct Pass. This was the masterpiece of the paper arsenal. Meticulously designed to look like an official military document, it bore the seals of the Allied High Command and provided explicit, step-by-step instructions for surrender. It was a script for an act that had previously been unthinkable, transforming it from an abstract betrayal into a concrete, bureaucratic procedure. Its text was a model of clarity. Hold this leaflet high. Approach American lines slowly. You will not be shot. You will be given food and medical care. It solved the how-to of surrender for a soldier who might be considering it. The strategic news leaflet. This weapon was designed to break the Japanese military's information monopoly. Using maps, photographs, and concise text, these leaflets delivered verifiable facts about the course of the war, the fall of Saipan and Iwo Jima, the destruction of the Japanese fleet in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and the strategic bombing of Japanese cities. The goal was to shatter the myth of inevitable Japanese victory and demonstrate the hopelessness of the tactical situation. A soldier told his side was winning could look at a map showing his garrison completely isolated and surrounded. The thought leaflet. This was the most subtle and psychologically sophisticated weapon. It bypassed military arguments entirely to appeal to the soldier's humanity. It often featured idyllic images of the Japanese countryside, snow-capped Mount Fuji, cherry blossoms, a peaceful farmhouse. The text would speak softly of his family, his parents, his children. Your aged mother prays for your return, it might say. Do not make her sacrifice a complete one. The war is lost, but life remains. This leaflet aimed to create a powerful cognitive dissonance, pitting his conditioned duty to die against his innate desire to live for his loved ones. The production of this arsenal was a logistical marvel. Mobile printing units, established on captured islands like Saipan and Okinawa, housed high-speed offset presses that ran around the clock, producing millions of leaflets per week. The paper was chosen for its specific weight and durability. The ink was formulated to be water-resistant. The scale was almost incomprehensible. By 1945, the PWB was producing over 2 million leaflets every single day, with a final wartime total estimated at nearly 1.5 billion. Delivery was its own specialized science. Specially modified B-24 Liberators and B-29 Superfortresses became leaflet bombers, their bomb bays packed not with explosives, but with paper cylinders. Over target areas, these canisters would be released, bursting open at a predetermined altitude to create a silent, fluttering blizzard that blanketed Japanese positions. For more tactical, pinpoint distribution, artillery shells and mortar rounds were modified to carry and disperse leaflets directly over enemy trenches and cave entrances. This was not a scattergun approach. The PWB operated as a combat laboratory, constantly analyzing captured diaries, letters, and interrogation reports from POWs. This intelligence feedback loop allowed them to refine their messages in real time. If diaries revealed troops were suffering from malaria, a leaflet would detail the medical care, including quinine, available in POW camps. If a specific unit was mentioned as having low morale, it would be targeted with tailored messages. The paper arsenal was a living, evolving weapon system, its aim growing more precise with every battle. The factories of truth were operating at full capacity, and their silent, pervasive output was about to rain down upon the fortress of the Japanese mind, testing its walls not with force, but with fact. The Imperial Japanese Army's official stance was absolute. American propaganda leaflets were gokui, forbidden contraband. They were to be collected and burned immediately, their contents unread. This directive, however, contained a critical and revealing flaw. While enlisted men were threatened with severe punishment for even glancing at the fluttering papers, the officers, the very men tasked with enforcing this prohibition, found themselves compelled to violate it. For them, it was a matter of tactical necessity. To effectively counter the enemy's psychological campaign, they had to understand its content. And so, in the secluded darkness of command dugouts and camouflaged headquarters, by the guttering light of a kerosene lamp, the lieutenants, captains, and colonels secretly smoothed out the captured leaflets. In doing so, they were exposed to a devastating truth their own high command had worked tirelessly to suppress, and they began to realize, with a cold, dawning horror, that they had already lost the war of words, and by extension, the war itself. For these officers, the act of reading was a profound transgression against their own indoctrination. They were the guardians of the Yamato Damashii, the enforcers of a code that equated surrender with eternal shame. Yet, the documents they held were not the crude, hate-filled screeds they had been led to expect. They were disconcertingly rational, fact-based, and culturally astute. The first and most shocking realization was the sheer, unnerving accuracy of American intelligence. A leaflet would not simply say surrender. It would name the officer's specific regiment, battalion, and even company commander. It would reference a recent, small-scale engagement, accurately describing Japanese casualties. It would display a detailed, professionally rendered map of the island, with American advances marked with a precision that mirrored, and sometimes surpassed, their own situation maps. This was not guesswork. It was the product of a superior intelligence apparatus that saw them with terrifying clarity. The Americans were not blindly bombarding them. They were speaking directly to them, by name and by unit, demonstrating an omniscience that shattered the illusion of their own operational security. The content aimed specifically at officers was designed to exploit their unique burdens and vulnerabilities. While the Safe Conduct Pass was a universal tool, other messages directly challenged their leadership and honor, striking at the core of their debt of obligation. You have told your men that reinforcements are coming, one leaflet might state with chilling specificity. But you know the Imperial Navy has been destroyed. Are you leading your men to a glorious death or a pointless starvation? Is this your duty as an officer and a samurai? This was a masterstroke of psychological targeting. It reframed the officer's sacred duty from leading a glorious sacrifice to presiding over a wasteful, meaningless annihilation of the emperor's subjects for the sake of his own personal honor. It forced him to confront the possibility that the code of Bushido, as interpreted by his superiors, was not a path to honor, but a dereliction of his fundamental responsibility to his men. Other leaflets delivered strategic news that the Japanese high command had deliberately concealed or blatantly lied about. An officer on Okinawa, fighting in isolation and clinging to the promise of a great, war-turning naval victory, would read a leaflet titled "The End of the Yamato." It would provide irrefutable details, the exact date, the location south of Kyushu, the number of American aircraft involved, the minimal U.S. losses of the super battleship's destruction. This single leaflet could collapse an officer's entire worldview. The Yamato was not just a warship. It was a symbol of Japanese naval power and national pride. Its loss, confirmed in stark, factual detail by the enemy, was catastrophic. The leaflet's concluding question was devastating. If the Yamato is gone, what hope is there for you on this island? This created an unbearable cognitive dissonance. The officer was forced to choose between the optimistic lies of his own command and the verifiable, grim facts presented by the enemy. The cumulative effect of this forbidden knowledge was a deep, corrosive, and silent erosion of morale at the command level. The American leaflets were winning the argument not with emotion, but with evidence. They were systematically dismantling the three pillars of an officer's resolve: faith in ultimate victory, trust in the integrity of his chain of command, and the belief in the strategic value of his sacrifice. A junior officer who now knew the war was strategically lost, who saw his men succumbing to starvation and disease, and who was presented with a safe conduct pass that promised their survival, faced an existential crisis. The rigid code of the Senjinkan offered only one path, Gyokusai. But the American leaflet offered a different, pragmatic, and life-affirming alternative. It presented surrender not as an act of treason, but as the only logical, responsible choice left for a commander who truly cared for his men. This secret crisis of conscience had tangible, if subtle, consequences on the battlefield. In some sectors, officers became less aggressive, conserving their strength and avoiding the costly banzai charges that characterized earlier battles. Interrogation reports from later captured POWs revealed that in several instances, junior officers had made the conscious decision not to enforce the order to burn captured leaflets, allowing the information to circulate quietly among the ranks. In a few, rare, but significant cases, officers were reported to have tacitly allowed small groups of their most wounded or exhausted soldiers to slip away and attempt surrender under the cover of darkness, turning a blind eye to their disappearance from the lines. The officers, the intended enforcers of the unbreakable spirit, had become its most conflicted victims. They were trapped between a code that demanded a beautiful death and a reality that rendered that death futile. By reading the forbidden leaflets, they had been forced to glimpse the war from the American perspective, a perspective of overwhelming material superiority, impeccable intelligence, and inevitable victory. They realized that the Americans were not just fighting a war of annihilation, they were fighting a war of information. And in that battle, the simple, truthful words on a piece of paper were proving more powerful than all the dogma of the divine wind. The real battle was no longer for the island they stood on, but for the conviction to die for it. And in the quiet of their command posts, an increasing number of officers were losing that conviction. The final stage of the psychological collapse was not marked by dramatic speeches or formal declarations, but by a quiet, profound, and collective realization that seeped through the Japanese officer corps like a slow-acting poison. It was the silent admission, an acknowledgement made not to their superiors or even to each other, but in the private recesses of their own minds, that the war was unwinnable. The American leaflets, once dismissed as enemy lies, had become a dreaded but reliable source of strategic truth. This admission did not immediately lead to mass surrender, but it fundamentally broke the Japanese military's will to fight to the last man, transforming a sacred crusade into a managed defeat and ultimately saving countless lives on both sides. This silent admission manifested in several critical ways. The most telling was the dramatic shift in surrender statistics, particularly during the Battle of Okinawa. While the majority of the Japanese garrison fought with characteristic ferocity, over 10,000 soldiers were taken prisoner, a number that would have been unimaginable in the early years of the war. More significant than the raw number was the changing nature of these surrenders. Interrogation reports revealed that an increasing number of prisoners were not just the starved, wounded, or unconscious, but were conscious soldiers and even junior officers who had made a rational decision to lay down their arms. They frequently cited the information in the leaflets as the decisive factor. The Safe Conduct Pass had provided the method. The news leaflets had provided the justification. They knew the Yamato was sunk. They knew Japan's cities were being burned to the ground. They knew no help was coming. The American truth had stripped their sacrifice of its meaning. For the officers, this admission was often expressed through inaction, a subtle but critical failure to enforce the very dogma they were sworn to uphold. The once absolute order to destroy all enemy leaflets was increasingly ignored. Commanders turned a blind eye as the flimsy papers circulated among their weary men, understanding that to suppress them was to admit their power. In some sectors on Okinawa and in the Philippines, officers made tacit calculations. Faced with an imminent American assault, they would concentrate their able-bodied troops for a final stand while quietly allowing the severely wounded to be left behind with their safe conduct passes, a silent and merciful abdication of the Senjinkan's demand for a unified, glorious death. This was not the fanaticism of old, but the grim pragmatism of commanders who knew the end was near and saw no virtue in a completely futile annihilation. The ultimate testament to the success of the psychological campaign came in the immediate aftermath of the emperor's surrender announcement on August 15, 1945. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific and Asia, hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers, from isolated atolls to the Chinese mainland, laid down their arms in an orderly, if stunned, fashion. There was no universal, catastrophic gyokusai of the entire Imperial Japanese Army, as hardliners in Tokyo had urged. While there were isolated incidents of defiance and suicide, the overwhelming majority complied with the surrender order. This was, in large part, because the American psychological warfare campaign had prepared the ground. The soldiers and their officers were not surrendering to an unknown, barbaric enemy. For months, they had been holding the instructions. They had been reading about the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. They had been shown evidence of humane treatment. The surrender was not a shocking descent into shame, but the final, logical step in a process the American leaflets had meticulously outlined. The PWB had, in effect, prescripted the surrender for them. The final, strategic impact of this silent admission is measured in the lives that were not lost. The planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, was projected to be the bloodiest campaign in human history. Conservative estimates predicted hundreds of thousands of American casualties and millions of Japanese military and civilian deaths. The successful inducement of surrender through psychological means, in conjunction with the atomic bombs and the Soviet entry, made this invasion unnecessary. Every soldier who surrendered on Okinawa, every officer who chose not to enforce a suicidal last stand, every garrison that complied with the surrender order represented a saving of lives on a monumental scale. When Japanese officers read those American leaflets, they were not just reading enemy propaganda. They were reading their own operational obituary, written by an adversary who understood their situation better than their own high command. The leaflets forced them to confront a reality that Imperial headquarters had desperately tried to conceal, that the war was lost, that their sacrifices were becoming meaningless, and that the enemy was not a demon but a formidable, rational, and surprisingly humane force. This knowledge broke the spell of the unbreakable spirit. It transformed the officer from a blind instrument of divine will into a rational actor making choices in an unwinnable war. Their silent admission of defeat, communicated not in words but in their actions and inactions, was the ultimate victory for the American war of words. It proved that the most powerful weapon is not always the one that destroys the body, but the one that can change the mind, ending a war not with the exhaustion of ammunition, but with the triumph of truth over dogma.